Snow exploded under Daniel Mercer's boots as he dragged the saddle from his last horse in the screaming blizzard. The wind tore through his coat, right across the old bullet scar buried under his ribs. A wound from the cattle war that never stopped burning in winter. Then a thin cry cut through the storm. "Not wolf, not wind." A child stumbled from the white darkness. Little Emily Harper. Barefoot. Freezing. Riders were already moving somewhere beyond the snow. Men who would not spare a witness. Daniel Mercer gripped the reins of his only horse, because giving it away meant walking into the blizzard alone. And his life was about to change forever. Before we ride deeper into the story, hit subscribe, ring the bell, so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now let's get back to the trail. The blizzard thinned as dawn pushed gray light across the valley. Daniel Mercer walked the last mile on frozen legs. Snow creaked under every step. The child hung against his shoulder beneath his coat, small, silent, still breathing. Ahead, a squat building leaned beside the road. Weathered boards, one crooked lantern swinging in the wind, the trading post. Daniel reached the door and shoved it open. Warm air hit his face, wood smoke, grease, coffee gone bitter on the stove. A thick man behind the counter looked up, eyes narrowed. The man glanced at Daniel's empty saddle strap dragging behind him, then at the bundle in Daniel's arms. "You track snow into my floor again, and I'll charge you double." Daniel said nothing. He crossed the room and set the child carefully on a chair near the stove. The little girl blinked against the sudden light. Snow melted in her hair, 3 years old at most, tiny hands red with cold. Her eyes moved slowly around the room, taking everything in. Daniel pulled off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. The storekeeper scratched his beard. "That yours?" "No." Daniel's voice came rough. The man snorted. "Then you best take it somewhere else." Daniel turned toward the stove, held his hands over the fire. The bullet scar under his ribs burned deep. Cold always woke it. Behind him, the girl slid from the chair. Small boots thumped the floor. She walked carefully across the room, stopped beside Daniel. Her fingers caught the edge of his sleeve, not scared, just steady. "Emily." Her voice was thin. Daniel looked down. She pointed toward herself. "Emily Harper." The storekeeper rolled his eyes. "Well, Emily Harper ain't staying here." He leaned across the counter. "This ain't no orphan house." Daniel stared at the fire. Snow slid off the roof outside with a heavy thud. Wind rattled the window. Emily watched the flames for a moment, then she reached both hands toward them. Daniel pulled her back before she could touch the iron. She didn't cry, just looked at him. The storekeeper tapped the counter with thick fingers. "You pay for the stove heat or you move on." Daniel reached into his pocket. Empty. He knew that before his hand went in, the last thing he owned with value was gone. A horse traded in the white storm for a child's life. The storekeeper noticed the empty pocket. Thought so. He jerked his chin toward the door. "You can warm up outside same as the snow." Daniel stood still. Firelight moved across the girl's face. Her eyes stayed on the flames like she had never seen warmth before. Outside, a wagon rattled past in the wind. A driver shouted something into the storm. Daniel listened. Then he picked Emily up again. The storekeeper grinned. "Smart choice." Daniel walked to the door, opened it. Cold flooded the room. The wind howled across the valley. Emily wrapped her arms around his neck, tiny, light. Daniel stepped out into the white morning. The door slammed behind him. Snow stretched across the road in every direction. No horse, no wagon, just miles of winter. Emily rested her head against his shoulder, quiet, trusting. Daniel looked down the empty trail leading toward his distant cabin, a long walk through frozen country. He tightened his grip around the child, then started walking. By the time Daniel Mercer saw his cabin, the sky had turned the color of old iron. Snow lay hard against the walls. The chimney stood black and still. No smoke, no welcome, just the shape of a life he had built to keep the world out. He climbed the porch with Emily in his arms and shoved the door open with his shoulder. Cold waited inside, cold. The kind that had settled into the table, the bed frame, the floorboards, the very nails in the walls. Daniel carried the child straight to the hearth. Set her down on a folded buffalo robe. Then he knelt and worked flint to kindling with stiff fingers. Once, twice, 3 times, the spark caught, a weak orange thread, then flame. Emily watched it grow without a sound. Daniel fed it split pine, more, then more. At last the cabin began to breathe. He crossed to the water bucket, ice on top. He cracked it with the butt of a knife, poured water into a kettle, set it over the fire. Then he turned toward the child. She sat where he had left her, coat wrapped around her, small hands tucked beneath her arms, wide eyes following everything. Daniel opened a chest near the bed and dug out an old wool blanket. He stopped for a beat, his hand resting on the folded cloth beneath it. A smaller blanket, faded blue, years old, unused. He shut the lid harder than he meant to. Emily flinched. Daniel said nothing. He carried the wool blanket to her and draped it around her shoulders. The kettle began to whisper. He sliced the heel from a loaf gone nearly stale, set it near the fire to soften, poured hot water into a tin cup. Dropped in a little molasses. When he handed it to Emily, she took it with both hands, careful like it mattered. She sipped, then blinked at the sweetness. A flicker passed across her face, not quite a smile, something smaller, something that still changed the room. Wind hit the cabin wall with a low shove. Snow hissed against the window. Daniel moved to the door and set the bar in place. Then he checked the shutters, the rifle above the mantel, the mate hooks, the stack of split wood. Every motion exact. Every motion used to being enough. Emily drank in silence. When the bread softened, Daniel tore it into pieces and handed them over one at a time. She ate slowly. No grabbing, no crying, no questions, just watched him with those steady little eyes. He hated that, not the child. The way she looked at him as if he was something solid, as if solid things did not break. The fire gained strength. Light moved across the walls, across the scar under Daniel's shirt when he bent to lift another log. Emily noticed. Her gaze stopped there. Daniel straightened too fast. Pain caught him under the ribs, sharp. He put a hand to his side before he could stop himself. Emily lowered the bread. Hurts. One word, soft. Daniel stared at the fire. The scar had come from a bullet and a frozen creek bank and a morning full of gun smoke. From the cattle war. From the day his brother Noah bled out holding Daniel's coat in both fists. From the day Daniel learned that saving one thing often meant losing another. He did not speak any of that. He only nodded once. Emily considered him. Not frightened, not pitying, just seeing. Then she tore off the smallest piece of bread from her own share and held it toward him. Daniel looked at the bread, then at her. The cabin went quiet except for the fire and the wind. He took it, a crumb in his palm. Yet the act landed heavy. Emily returned to eating, like the matter was settled. Daniel moved to the table and sat for the first time since dawn. His legs ached from the long walk. His hands were scraped raw from cold leather and frozen reins and the rough strap he had used to carry the saddle. He looked toward the peg by the door where a bridle should have hung. Empty now, his last horse gone into the storm, traded for one child's life. He tried not to think about spring work, about hauling wood, about hauling water. About the long miles to town, he tried not to think at all. Emily finished the bread and set her cup down with care. Then she slid off the robe and wandered the cabin in small, silent steps. She touched nothing at first, only looked. The wash basin, the boots by the wall, the hanging skillet, the Bible on the shelf. Then she reached the chair near the bed and found a torn shirt Daniel had left there for mending and never touched again. The sleeve had ripped clear at the seam. Emily lifted it, studied it. Then looked around until she found the tin sewing box on the shelf. Daniel watched without moving. She carried it to the table, could barely lift it, set it down, opened it. Needles, thread, buttons in a chipped saucer. She chose a needle with clumsy fingers and tugged at a spool of dark thread. Missed, tried again. Daniel rose, crossed the room. He took the needle from her, threaded it in one motion and handed it back. Emily nodded once. No smile, just work. She bent over the shirt, tongue pressed to the corner of her mouth, and made 3 crooked stitches that would never hold a grown man's arm. Still, the ripped cloth sat closer together than before. Daniel looked at the tiny hand pulling thread through worn cotton. The cabin had been a place of silence for 3 winters, a place where even the clock had stopped because he never wound it. Now there was the sound of thread sliding through cloth, a little scrape of chair legs, breathing besides his own. Outside, something knocked faintly against the wall. Daniel was at the rifle in a blink. He lifted it, held still, listened, only wind. Then another sound farther off, a wagon bell dull through the storm, voices maybe, or only branches grinding under ice. Emily looked up at the rifle but did not cry. Daniel crossed to the window and eased the shutter a finger's width. White world, no shape near the cabin, yet tracks on the road beyond the drift, fresh enough not to be buried. A wagon had passed sometime before dusk. This far up the valley in weather like this, few men traveled by choice. Daniel closed the shutter, set the rifle back slower than he had grabbed it. The child resumed her crooked sewing. Daniel returned to the hearth and laid on more wood. Night came fast after that. He made a pallet near the fire from blankets and the buffalo robe. Emily sat on the edge of it while he poured the last of the kettle water into a basin. He knelt before her with a rag. She looked uncertain for the first time, then held out her hands. He cleaned the dirt and cold from her fingers, the red knuckles, the tiny crescents where she had pressed nails into her own skin against the freeze, then her face. A streak of soot came away from one cheek, another from her chin. Under the grime she looked even smaller, too small for the road, too small for blizzard and strange men and empty country. Daniel wrung out the cloth, set it aside. He found one of Noah's old wool socks in a drawer and pulled it over her feet one at a time. Too big, good enough. Emily looked down at them. Then up at him, "Thank you." The words came plain, not timid. Daniel rose and busied himself at the table. A man could answer thanks. A man should. He did not. Instead, he cut another slice of bread for morning, checked the latch once more, added one more log to the fire. When he turned back, Emily had curled beneath the blanket with one hand still resting on the mended shirt beside her. Sleep had come quick. Children could do that. Step over fear and drop straight into dreams. Daniel lowered himself into the chair by the hearth. Pain pulled under his ribs as he sat. He pressed a palm there until it eased. Firelight touched the cabin's ceiling. The room smelled of wood smoke and damp wool and melted snow, a lived-in smell. He had almost forgotten it. For a long time he watched the child sleep. The storm softened outside, not ended, only waiting, At some hour deep in the night, Emily stirred. A small troubled sound left her throat. Daniel was awake at once. She did not open her eyes, only turned her head and whispered one word into the blanket: "Mama." Then silence again. Daniel leaned back in the chair, looked at the fire until the logs collapsed inward. Morning arrived pale and bitter. The storm had passed, leaving the world buried. Snow rose against the porch like a white wall. Daniel pulled on his coat and went out with a shovel before the child woke. Each lift bit at his side. Each breath smoked in front of him. He cleared the door, the path to the woodpile, the way to the well. By the time he hauled the first bucket in, his shirt stuck damp to the scar beneath it. Emily stood by the hearth in the big wool socks and his coat hanging from her shoulders like a borrowed life. She had folded her blanket, stacked the tin cup beside the basin, and laid the shirt she had stitched across the chair as if presenting finished work. Daniel set down the bucket, looked at the room. Something in it had shifted. Still poor, still cold at the edges, still one hard winter away from ruin. Yet not empty. Emily pointed at the frosted window. More snow. Daniel glanced outside, then toward the road to town that would stay buried for days, maybe longer. No sheriff would come, no pastor, no wagon of kind ladies asking after lost children. Only winter, only distance. Only what a man chose. He took down a strip of smoked venison from the rafters and cut it into thin pieces, set porridge to boil. Emily climbed into the chair without being asked. When he placed the bowl before her, she waited, hands in her lap. Daniel sat across from her with his own bowl. Steam rose between them. At last he spoke, "Till spring." Emily blinked. He held her gaze. "You stay here till spring thaw, then I take you to town, ask questions, find your people if they're there." The child listened, as if the words were heavy tools being set in place. Snow tapped softly at the window. The fire cracked. Daniel added, "You mind me, stay close, do your part." Emily looked down at the porridge, then nodded once. A solemn nod from a face no bigger than his hand. She lifted the spoon with both fingers and began to eat. Daniel watched her for a moment, then he ate too. Outside, the valley lay locked in white. Months of winter ahead. A cabin too small for two sorrows, too far from town, too near whatever had put a 3-year-old child alone in a blizzard. Yet the agreement had been made, not with a handshake, not with warmth, just a bowl of porridge, a fire, and the slow sound of snow settling on the roof. The days found a shape after that, hard, plain, steady. Daniel Mercer rose before first light and built the fire back from coals. He hauled water from the well through waist-deep drifts, split pine with slow, careful blows that spared his ribs when he could, fed the muleless emptiness of the yard with his own boots and shoulders. Inside, Emily Harper learned the cabin by inches. She folded blankets too big for her arms, stacked tin cups, carried kindling one stick at a time from the wood box to the hearth. When Daniel came in from the cold, he would find the small pile waiting, crooked, careful, useful. She never boasted over it, never looked for praise, just moved back to the stool by the fire and watched the porridge thicken. The cabin sounded different now, a spoon against a bowl. Little feet on plank floor, the soft drag of a blanket being straightened. For 3 winters, Daniel had heard only wind, axe, kettle, and his own breathing. Now presence lived in the room. He did not trust how quickly a man could grow used to that. One morning, the snow crust broke under him at the well. His leg plunged to the thigh. Pain shot under the old bullet scar like a knife pulled sideways. He gripped the frozen stones and held still until the dark pass in his vision cleared. When he limped back inside, water sloshing from the bucket, Emily was already at the table with the sewing tin open. His split glove lay across her lap. She had found the tear in the thumb, threaded the needle badly, started anyway. Daniel set the bucket down and stood over her, her little brow pinched. Her tongue touched the corner of her mouth. The stitches looked like fence wire after a storm, still they closed the hole. Daniel took the glove, turned it once in his hand, then hung it by the stove to dry. Emily waited. He only said, "Good." One word, yet the room warmed in a way the fire had not done. By the second week she knew his routines, knew when the coffee tin came down, when the trap-line pouch was checked, when the venison had to be turned in the smoke. She followed without getting underfoot, observant, silent. When he sharpened the skinning knife, she pushed the whetstone closer before he asked. When ashes filled the hearth, she fetched the shovel and held the pan steady. The child had come from storm and fear, yet work seemed to settle her. As if usefulness built its own kind of shelter. Then the weather broke ugly again. A hard blue day turned white by noon. Wind drove needles of snow beneath the door. Daniel had to tie a rope from porch post to woodshed just across 10 steps without losing the line of the house. He left Emily under strict instruction to stay by the fire. When he came back with his arms loaded, she was where he had left her, but the Bible sat open on the table, not from reading. From pictures pressed between its pages, old ones, a tintype of Daniel and Noah Mercer standing beside a rail fence in better years, 2 clean-shaven brothers in their 30s, broad shoulders, straight backs, no wives, no children, no grave dirt on their boots yet. Emily touched the edge of the picture with one finger. Brother. Daniel stopped. Snow melted from his coat and darkened the floorboards. He took the tintype from the table, looked once. Noah's grin still carried a kind of foolish courage, the kind of courage that got good men buried. Daniel slid the picture back inside the Bible and closed it. That was all he gave her. Emily nodded, as if she understood the size of that one word. She went back to lining up dry beans in a row along the table seam. Daniel stood by the window, staring into blowing white, and hated how the child could touch a dead thing without ever laying a hand on it. When the storm eased 2 days later, he took the sled down the road toward the trading post. No horse, only rope over his shoulder and runners scraping ice. Emily rode wrapped in blankets atop sacks of hides and 2 bundles of kindling to barter. The world glittered so bright it hurt the eyes. Pines bowed heavy with snow. The creek ran black in narrow cuts beneath the ice. The road held old wagon ruts turned to stone. At the post, smoke poured from the stovepipe. Men stood outside stamping boots. 2 ranchers from farther down valley, a freight driver, the keeper with the beard. Their talk thinned when Daniel approached with the child. That silence said enough. He hauled the hides inside and laid them on the counter. The keeper weighed them with a look that shaved value from everything. "Road agents took the East Pass," he muttered. "Freight wagon hit last week. Driver swears it was Caldwell men." Daniel said nothing. The name hung in the air. Victor Caldwell, land buyer, debt collector, valley whisper, a man who never dirtied his own gloves when another man's fear would do the work. One of the ranchers spat near the stove. "He's buying notes from the bank in Dry Creek. Little places first, widow parcels, Winterbrook spreads, then he sends paper and riders in that order." The other man kept his eyes on his coffee. "Paper S only for manners, riders are the message." Emily stood close to Daniel's leg, quiet, listening. The storekeeper glanced down at her and then away too fast. Caldwell's men asked this morning whether anybody had seen a stray child on the North Road. Daniel's hand tightened on the counter, just once. Enough. The keeper shrugged like he wished he had never spoken. Said a wealthy family back east lost kin in the storm, promised money for news, big money. No one in the room believed that story. Daniel could smell the lie on it, same as smoke on wet wool. He traded the hides for flour, beans, lamp oil, and a little sugar he had not meant to buy. Emily noticed the sugar sack at once, said nothing. Outside, while he tied the goods to the sled, the freight driver stepped near and spoke low. Caldwell's got his eye on every spread between the ridge and the frozen creek. Yours too. Daniel pulled the knot tighter. The man shifted, uneasy. Word is you got no stock left. No hired hand, no horse now either. Men like Caldwell count those things. Daniel straightened, looked at him once. The man stepped back, not out of fear exactly. Out of respect for the kind of silence that left no room for another question. The trip home felt longer. The sled dragged heavy. Wind came up from the west, carrying a bitter edge. Emily dozed beneath the blankets until a sharp jolt woke her. One runner had struck something buried in snow. Daniel knelt and dug with bare hands. A strip of leather, broken harness, freshly cut. He looked at the road, saw prints half filled with powder, 3 horses, 1 wagon, passed this way not long before. He rose slowly. The valley seemed too still. Even the crows held back. Emily watched his face. Bad. Daniel scanned the ridgeline, the pines, the white draw beyond the creek bend. Maybe. He pulled the blanket higher around her and started the sled again. From then on he listened harder. Every crow call, every shifting branch, every far-off crack in the trees. By dusk he had barred the cabin door and set the rifle where his hand could find it blind. The routine of the place changed after that. Not broken, tightened. He checked the window latches twice, walked the yard at dawn for tracks, moved the axe from stump to porch. Emily felt it too. Children knew when air in a room had sharpened, yet she did not grow timid. She simply watched more. One evening Daniel came in from the woods with a load of deadfall on his shoulder and found her kneeling by the hearth beside a small pan of melted snow. She had dropped pine needles into it. The room smelled clean and green, fresh, almost like spring. She looked up as if caught at some great mischief. Daniel set the wood down. The pan steamed softly by the flames. For a moment the cabin did not feel like a lonely place dug into winter. It felt tended. That frightened him more than the tracks. A man could fight tracks, fight riders, fight hunger. It was harder to fight the slow return of hope. That same night after supper a sound drifted from outside. Not wind, not branch. 3 slow knocks against the hitching post in the yard. Wood on wood. Measured. Daniel was at the rifle before the second knock finished. He blew out the lamp with one breath. Darkness swallowed the room except for the red eye of the hearth. Emily froze by the table. No cry, no movement, just those steady eyes finding him in the dark. Another knock, then silence. Daniel eased to the window and lifted the shutter a sliver. Moonlight lay cold across the yard. No horse, no wagon, no man at the post, only something tied there swaying a little in the wind. He waited, counted 10 breaths, opened the door and stepped out with the rifle ready. Snow crunched under his boots. The night smelled of pine and old iron. At the hitching post hung a strip of black cloth knotted around a broken piece of leather harness. The same leather he had seen under the sled runner. A sign, not theft, not accident, a message. Daniel cut it down and brought it inside. By firelight, the black cloth showed a faint stamped mark. A small silver crown worked into the weave. Emily pointed at it from across the room. Daniel had seen that mark before, on the lapel of a man at the trading post weeks back. one of Caldwell's clerks. The kind who smiled while measuring another man's ruin. He fed the cloth to the fire, watched it curl, watched the crown darken and vanish. Emily stood in the glow with the wool blanket around her shoulders, tiny, still, trusting him to know what came next. Daniel slid the bar hard across the door, checked the powder in the rifle, then dragged the heavy table beneath the window without a word. Outside, the valley lay quiet under moonlit snow. Inside, the fire snapped and settled. And for the first time since the child had entered his life, Daniel knew the danger had found them back. Morning came brittle and pale. Daniel Mercer had not slept much. The rifle stayed across his knees until first light bled through the frosted glass. When he finally stood, his back ached from the chair and his side burned under the old scar. Emily Harper was already awake. She sat cross-legged on the pallet, blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the last coal settle in the hearth. No questions, just those steady eyes. Daniel stirred the fire back to life, fed it kindling, then bigger wood. Warmth crept through the room in slow red waves. He crossed to the door, lifted the bar, and stepped outside with the rifle in one hand. The yard looked untouched at first, white, still, innocent. Then he saw the boot prints, one man only, heavy heels. A deliberate walk from the road to the hitching post and back again. No hurry, no stumble, a man who wanted his visit seen. Daniel followed the tracks to the edge of the drift and stopped. Near the porch, half buried in churned snow, something small glinted. He crouched, brushed snow away. A brass button, fine made, stamped with the same crown mark he had watched burn in his fireplace. He closed his fist around it. Cold metal bit his palm. When he stepped back inside, Emily had set out the tin cups. She looked from his face to the button in his hand, then to the rifle. Man came. Daniel slipped the button into his pocket. Yes. She watched him for another beat. Then, without a word, she moved his coffee tin closer to the stove before he asked. The little act landed deeper than it should have. He cooked porridge in silence. They ate by the fire while wind whispered along the eaves. After breakfast, Daniel checked the loft, then the smokehouse, then the lean-to where tools hung. Nothing gone, nothing disturbed. That bothered him more than theft would have. A thief wanted things. This was pressure, the kind that breathed down a man's neck and waited for him to break himself. He was chopping kindling near the porch when Emily wandered to the chest by the bed. The same old chest he opened only when forced. She knelt in front of it and ran her fingers over the iron latch. Daniel almost told her no, almost. Then she looked up at him, not disobedient, only curious. He set the axe aside and crossed the room, opened the chest himself. Blankets, a spare shirt, an old cavalry coat Noah had taken off a dead man years ago and never worn. Underneath those, wrapped in a faded scrap of muslin, lay a child's mitten, single small, wool blue. Emily reached toward it, then stopped. Daniel took it first, held it in his rough hand. Years peeled back like bark in spring. A different winter, a different fire. His wife Anna laughing as she tried to teach him how to hold a newborn without looking like he was carrying a sack of grain. A tiny daughter who had lived 6 days, long enough for Daniel to know the feel of hope, not long enough to keep it. He stared at the mitten, then wrapped it again, set it gently back. Emily did not ask. She only laid her little hand on the edge of the chest beside his. No fear, no pity, just company. Daniel shut the lid. His throat worked once, that was all. Later, as he mended a hinge on the woodshed door, Emily sat on the floor with the Bible open in her lap, not reading, turning the pressed pages slowly. Something slipped free and fell onto the rug. A folded paper, old, crisp at the edges. Daniel frowned. He had not seen it before. Emily picked it up with both hands and carried it over. He unfolded it carefully. A map, survey lines, creek bends, parcel marks. Dry Creek Valley and the North Ridge laid out in black ink. At the bottom sat a banker's seal from Dry Creek and 2 signatures. One belonged to a man Daniel knew by reputation, Horace Bell, the bank clerk who sold debt like butchered meat. The other was harder to read. Then Daniel found the mark in the corner, a silver crown. The same symbol. His jaw tightened. He spread the map across the table. Several ranch parcels had been marked with pencil crosses: Widow Hensley's Place, the Barker Homestead, Old Man Tull's Lower Pasture, and Daniel's own spread, a line of acquisition, not random, planned. Emily pointed to a faint smear near the fold, a child's finger-sized streak of reddish-brown. Daniel brought the paper closer to the window. Wax, sealing wax. The same deep red used on railroad correspondence and Eastern legal packets. Not valley work, moneyed work. He turned the sheet over. A second folded page clung to the back where moisture had stuck it in years past. This one was smaller, official, part of a telegram copy. Most of the words had blurred, but enough remained. Harper Child's surviving storm. Transport intercepted North Road. Hold until claim settled. Daniel went completely still. Emily watched his face. He read it again. Harper. The child had spoken her surname the first day by the fire. Emily Harper, not a made-up name, not chance. Someone had intercepted her on purpose. Not road agents hunting random prey. Men sent, men who knew what she was worth. He looked at the little girl standing by the table in oversized socks and his old coat. A child. Yet attached to telegrams, bank seals, men who used clerks and riders instead of honest hands. He set the papers down slowly. Emily touched the blurred word with one finger. Me. Daniel nodded once. Looks like. The room changed shape around them. Same walls, same fire, yet now the danger had a spine and a reason. By afternoon, the sky had gone low and leaden. Daniel hid the map and telegram inside the stovepipe collar where no casual search would find them. Then he saddled himself for work he no longer had a horse to do. He dragged the hand sled to the wood line, cutting deadfall and hauling it back piece by piece. Emily stayed near the porch, gathering twigs into neat little bundles tied with string ends she had found in the sewing tin. Useful again, always useful. Each time Daniel looked up, she was there, a small shape against the white yard. Alive, real, worth protecting. That thought settled into him like iron. Near dusk, crows burst from the pines, all at once. A black flurry against the snow sky. Daniel straightened, listened. There, far off, the clatter of harness. A wagon, no, 2 horses. Coming hard down the road, he dropped the wood and ran for the porch. Inside. Emily did not freeze, did not ask why. She moved fast. Daniel slammed the door behind them and barred it. He killed the lamp, pulled the curtain across the back window. The sound outside grew louder, harness jingling, runners scraping ice. Then voices, male, laughing. The team halted in the yard. Daniel took the rifle from above the mantel and moved Emily behind the overturned table. Her breathing quickened, but she stayed low. Good girl. A boot hit the porch. Then another. A fist pounded the door. Open up, Mercer. Daniel knew the voice. One of Caldwell's Valley riders, Nate Pritchard, a man with neat gloves and rotten eyes. Another bang. We only come to speak. Daniel kept silent. Pritchard laughed. That little girl, in there's expensive trouble. The words fell into the cabin like stones. Emily looked at Daniel from behind the table, face pale in the hearth glow. Outside, another man walked around the house, boots crunching through crusted snow. A third tested the barn latch. Daniel heard it clearly. His free hand curled tighter on the rifle's stock. Pritchard called again. "Mr. Caldwell pays well for cooperation. Better than Winter pays a broke rancher." Still Daniel said nothing. Silence could be a wall when a man held it right. The porch boards creaked as Pritchard leaned close to the door. "We know who she is." A pause, then softer. "We know what happened to the transport north of Dry Creek. You can hand her over and keep your cabin, or we let Winter finish what it starts." The barn door slammed open outside. A moment later came the thud of boots and the scrape of something dragged across the floorboards. Daniel's jaw hardened. Kerosene. He could smell it even before the first bottle shattered. Glass burst. Liquid spread. Emily pressed both hands over her mouth. The next sound was the scratch of a match, then a whoomph. Orange light leapt through the cracks in the barn wall. Fire in winter made its own kind of terror. Too bright, too fast, too hungry. Heat bloomed across the yard while snow hissed around it. The horses outside snorted and shifted. Pritchard stepped off the porch laughing. "Think on it, Mercer." The men climbed back into the wagon. The team jerked forward. By the time Daniel flung the door open, they were already turning down the road, dark shapes against the whitening dusk. The barn roared. Flames climbed dry beams and old hay with savage ease. Daniel shoved the rifle into Emily's hands but first and pointed to the porch corner. "Stay." Then he ran. He broke the ice crust off the water barrel with 3 blows of an axe and heaved bucket after bucket at the wall of fire. Steam exploded back in his face. Smoke rolled thick and black. The roof groaned. Inside that barn sat half his winter stores: beans, salt pork, harness leather, seed sacks for spring. No horse now, no stock, but enough to live, enough to begin again. The fire took what it wanted. Daniel fought until his lungs burned raw and his side felt split open. Emily appeared at the edge of the porch, blanket around her shoulders, carrying the smallest bucket with both hands. He nearly shouted at her to go back. Nearly. Instead, he watched that tiny figure cross the snow, set the bucket by the barrel, fill it clumsily and drag it toward him. One trip, then another. Not much water, not enough to save the barn, but enough to keep the blaze from jumping to the cabin wall when sparks began to fly. They worked like that in heat and snow and smoke until the barn roof gave way with a shower of sparks and a sound like a tree breaking in the dark. Then it was over, not dead, but lost. The structure collapsed inward, hissing and spitting into a ruin of black beams and red coals. Night had fallen full by then. The yard glowed hellish orange against the snow. Daniel stood bent over, hands on knees, smoke coating his throat. Emily swayed beside the barrel, face streaked with soot, eyes wide and shining in the firelight. He crossed to her, knelt despite the pain, put both hands on her shoulders. She was trembling now, the shaking that comes after, not before. Daniel looked back at the burning remains of his barn, then toward the dark road where Caldwell's men had vanished. Something old woke in him, not rage alone. Rage burns hot and stupid. This was colder. A choice hardening under ash. He pulled Emily against his chest for one brief second, just enough, then set her back and looked her in the eye. No more. The words came low, rough, final. Behind them, the barn collapsed one last time in a fountain of sparks. Before them, the cabin stood black against the snow, small, threatened, still standing, and Daniel Mercer knew peace had just been burned out of the valley. By dawn, the barn was a skeleton of black ribs jutting from the snow, smoke still curled from the ruin. Daniel Mercer stood in the yard with a shovel, turning ash with the toe of his boot. Half-burned beans, warped iron, a cracked harness buckle. Loss had weight. It lay in the shoulders, in the jaw, in the silence a man kept because words could not lift anything. Behind him, the cabin door opened. Emily Harper stepped onto the porch wrapped in his old coat. Her hair was sleep-tangled. Her face still smudged with soot. She carried 2 tin cups, one nested inside the other so she would not spill the coffee. Daniel turned. For a moment, the sight of her standing there in the cold morning made the black ruin behind him seem smaller. Not gone, never gone, just smaller. He took the cup from her. Their fingers brushed. Emily looked past him at the ashes, then back at his face. Bad men. Daniel nodded once. Yes. She thought about that. Then she lifted the other cup and sipped with both hands, as if drinking coffee beside a burned barn was now simply part of life. Daniel stared at the ruin again. The old way rose in him: cut losses, keep low, endure, wait for spring and pray. It asked little. But Caldwell's men had burned that path with the hay and seed. There would be no keeping low now. The war had come to his yard. He finished the coffee in 3 swallows and set the cup on the porch rail. Then he went inside. Emily followed. He dragged the kitchen table into full light beneath the window, took the map and the telegram copy from the stovepipe collar, laid both flat. Then he added a sheet of old ledger paper, a stub of pencil, Noah's tin compass, and the brass crown button found in the snow. Pieces, signs. Truth never arrived whole in this country. A man had to gather it like firewood and stack it where others could see. Emily climbed onto the chair across from him, quiet, watching. Daniel marked the parcels crossed on the map: Widow Hensley, Barker, Old Tull, his own spread. Then he marked the road north of Dry Creek, where the telegram said the Harper transport had been intercepted. His pencil paused. Emily slid one small finger onto the map, not on any of the marked ranches, on the ravine by the frozen creek. Daniel looked at her. She tapped it again. Wagon. Memory lit in her eyes, fragmented. Yet there, Daniel leaned closer. Your wagon. Emily nodded. Her face tightened, not with fear exactly, with effort. I hide. 2 words, then she pointed to the pines above the ravine. Trees, snow, men loud. Daniel followed the line of her finger. If she had climbed from a wreck or ambush there and stumbled north in the storm, she could have reached the road where he found her. He made a mark on the map. A real one this time, not rumor, not guess. They set out before noon. Daniel wrapped the papers in oilcloth and tucked them inside his coat. He carried the rifle in one hand and pulled the hand sled with the other. Emily rode on blankets with a hot brick wrapped in cloth at her feet. The air cut clean and sharp, sky bright as broken glass. The valley no longer felt empty. Every rise held a watching place. Every stand of timber looked fit to hide a rider. Daniel moved with the old caution back in his bones, the caution that had once kept him alive in brush fights and frozen cattle drives. They reached the ravine by mid-afternoon. The creek below lay sealed under white crust. Pines leaned close over the slope. Wind sighed through the needles. Daniel found the first sign near a drifted stone, a wagon wheel rim half buried, broken clean. Farther down, beneath a crust of old snow, a shred of velvet caught on a branch, child-sized, blue. Emily saw it and touched the front of her coat, matching cloth. Daniel scanned the ravine, then found more, a snapped trace chain, a patch of dark stain frozen into the packed snow under the trees, not fresh, not old enough to forget. Gunfire had happened here. A struggle, a stop planned where the road narrowed and the ravine gave men cover. Emily looked away from the stain and pressed closer to his leg. Daniel rested one hand on her shoulder. No words, only steady pressure. Then he climbed higher along the trees and found what he had come for, a leather case wedged beneath a fallen limb, hidden by snow and shadow. He cut it free. Inside lay soaked papers, most ruined, one not. A bill of carriage from Cheyenne to Dry Creek, naming one passenger party under escort, Mrs. Eliza Harper and child. Destination, family representatives at Dry Creek Station. Daniel read it once, then again. The mother's name sat there plain as daylight. Emily stared up at him. My mamma. Daniel folded the paper carefully. His voice came low. She was with you. Not is. Was. Emily understood the difference even if she did not understand all of it. Her face went still, too still for a child. Daniel slipped the document into his coat with the others. The wind shifted. With it came another sound, distant, metal against leather. Daniel turned. Two riders stood on the ridge above the ravine, dark against the snow glare, too far to see faces, close enough to be sure. Watching, Daniel lifted the rifle. The riders did not rush, did not wave. One tipped his hat in a slow, mocking motion. Then both turned and vanished into the pines. Pressure again, measured. A reminder that Caldwell's men knew exactly where to look. Daniel got Emily onto the sled and headed home hard. No pause, no wasted trail. The protector in him had fully woken now, not the grieving rancher. Not the man waiting for winter to pass. The man who chose ground, chose timing, chose what he would defend and what he would strike. That night he did not sit by the fire and endure. He prepared. He cleaned Noah's old revolver and tucked it at the small of his back, counted rifle cartridges, sharpened the axe, wrote 3 names on the ledger paper: Widow Hensley, Old Tull, Barker, men and women Caldwell had pressed, neighbors who might still stand if somebody stood first. Emily sat on the floor stringing dried beans into a crooked necklace with thread from the sewing tin. Every so often she looked up to make sure he was still there. At one point Daniel crossed to her, knelt, and tied the final knot when her fingers slipped. She looked at the beans string, then at him. Pretty. Daniel almost smiled. Almost. He touched the tip of one bean, then stood. Before first light the next morning, he left Emily at the trading post with the keeper's wife, a hard-faced woman named Ruth Keeler who had once buried 2 sons and no longer wasted softness on fools. She looked at the burned smell still clinging to Emily's coat, then at Daniel's face. That Caldwell. Daniel nodded. Ruth's mouth hardened. She stays with me. Daniel put the oilcloth packet on the counter. If I don't come back by dark, take her and these to Pastor Boone in Dry Creek. Ruth put one broad hand over the packet. I will. Emily did not cry when Daniel knelt before her. She only touched the front of his coat where the hidden papers rested, then laid her small palm over his heart. A child's blessing, a charge. Daniel rose and walked back into the cold. By noon he had gathered them. Old Tull from the lower pasture, bent but not broken. Widow Hensley in a heavy black coat with a shotgun across her lap in the wagon. Barker, red-eyed and raw from losing half his herd to Caldwell's winter claims. 3 neighbors and 1 stubborn truth brought into the same room at the Dry Creek meeting hall. Word spread fast. By mid-afternoon, the benches filled with townsfolk, ranch hands, clerks, and men pretending not to care. Victor Caldwell arrived last, tall, well-cut coat, clean gloves, silver watch chain at his vest. The kind of man who wore winter like an inconvenience suffered by lesser people. He smiled when he saw Daniel Mercer near the front, a thin smile, polite, confident. Then his gaze moved to the gathered neighbors and sharpened. The banker Horace Bell stood near him, sweating already. Pastor Boone opened the meeting with no ceremony, just truth. This valley has grievances. That was enough. Daniel did not speak first. He let the others do what fear had kept them from doing alone. Widow Hensley stood and unfolded the debt notice Caldwell's clerk had altered after her husband's death. Old Tull showed the boundary stakes moved in the night. Barker named the riders who had culled his cattle by force and then offered to buy his land cheap. Murmurs rolled through the hall. Caldwell kept his hands folded, smiled less. Then Daniel stepped forward. The room quieted, because silence clung to him the way smoke clung to burnt timber. He laid the crown button on the table, then the map with the marked parcels, then the telegram fragment, then the carriage bill naming Eliza Harper and child. No flourish, no speech, just one piece after another. Ruth Keeler entered then with Emily on her hip. A ripple moved through the hall. The child's presence did what papers alone could not, made the crime flesh, made it breathe. Emily saw Daniel and reached toward him. He took her from Ruth and set her on the table beside the documents so everyone could see the small blue coat, the solemn face, the human cost Caldwell had tried to turn into profit. Pastor Boone read the telegram aloud, not every word. Enough. Transport intercepted North Road. Hold until claim settled. The banker bell broke first. They often did. Sweat and guilt make poor partners. He began with denial, then excuses, then the whole rotten thing came out. Easton Harper funds tied up in guardianship. A missing child meant delayed inheritance. Delayed inheritance meant land leverage for men who knew how to place bets with other people's blood. Caldwell had financed the intercept, had planned to hold the child hidden until papers shifted and claims ripened. The hall erupted. Men stood. Women shouted. Somebody struck bell hard enough to spin him. Caldwell reached for the door. Daniel moved once, fast. The old cattle war speed still lived in him. He caught Caldwell by the coat front and drove him back against the wall hard enough to rattle the framed notice behind him. No wild fury, no flailing, just force finally given a rightful target. Caldwell saw it then, saw that Daniel was not bluff, not broken, not alone. The sheriff stepped in with 2 deputies, late but useful. Caldwell's gloves were pulled off. His wrists bound, his polish vanished in a breath. On the table, Emily sat very still amid the papers and looked out over the room as if she had crossed some long, terrible bridge and finally found solid ground. By evening, the town square lay under a blue spring dusk. Snowmelt dripped from roofs. Mud showed through the ruts. Caldwell rode out in irons, Bell beside him. The townsfolk watched in a silence deeper than cheering. Justice, when it finally comes, is often quieter than revenge. Daniel stood on the boardwalk with Emily in his arms. She had fallen asleep against his shoulder before the wagon turned the corner. Warm. Trusting, safe, Pastor Boone came to stand beside him. So what now? Daniel looked down at the child, then out toward the valley road leading home, the home still standing, the barn gone, the land scarred, yet theirs still. He answered in the only way that fit. We rebuild. And for the first time in many winters, when Daniel Mercer said the word we, it did not sound strange in his mouth. Spring came slowly to the valley, not all at once. First, the snow shrank from the fence posts, then the creek broke loose under its ice shell, then the ground began to smell like earth again. Daniel Mercer stood where his barn had burned. The charred beams were gone now. Neighbors had helped haul them away. In their place rose fresh timber, new posts, new rails, not tall yet, not finished, but standing. Old Tull hammered a spike into the frame and leaned back to look at the work. Better than the last one. Daniel nodded. Widow Hensley drove a wagon past the yard with 2 young calves in the back. She tipped her hat. Spring favors the stubborn. Daniel lifted a hand. Work had filled the valley again. Men who had once lowered their heads now walked straighter. Caldwell's riders were gone. The land had exhaled. Behind the cabin, Emily Harper sat on a stump beside a small wooden crate. Inside it clucked 6 yellow chicks. She held a handful of cracked grain and dropped it slowly so none of them missed a piece. Her blue coat had been replaced by a small brown dress Ruth Keeler had sewn, still too big, still growing into it. Daniel watched her for a moment. She had not asked about her mother again. Children knew when questions had no place to land yet. She simply worked, carrying water in a little tin bucket, stacking kindling in crooked rows, talking softly to the chicks as if they understood. The cabin door creaked open behind him. Ruth Keeler stepped out and wiped flour from her hands. "You got visitors coming." Daniel turned toward the road. A wagon approached through the thawing mud. Fine-built, Eastern harness, 2 riders behind it, not Caldwell's kind. These men sat straighter, careful. The wagon stopped near the gate. A gray-haired man climbed down first, then a woman wrapped in travel black, her face pale, her eyes searching. The moment she saw the little girl by the chicks, her breath caught. Emily. The name came out like a prayer spoken after a long silence. Emily turned, looked. The grain slipped from her hand. "Mama." The woman ran, not careful, not proud, just fast. She dropped to her knees in the mud and gathered the child into her arms. The valley held its breath. Emily pressed her face into the woman's shoulder and held tight. Daniel watched, still, quiet. The gray-haired man approached him slowly. "Daniel Mercer." Daniel nodded once. "Jonathan Harper." The man removed his hat. "You saved my granddaughter's life." Daniel glanced toward the reunion in the yard. Emily was speaking quickly now, little hands waving as she told a story only she fully understood. Her mother held her like someone afraid the world might try to take her again. Jonathan Harper followed Daniel's gaze. "We will take care of her now." Daniel said nothing. That had always been the end of this road. The plan from the beginning: spring, town, family, return. Still, the silence in his chest felt heavier than it should. Emily broke away suddenly and ran across the yard. She stopped in front of Daniel, small, serious. Her hand opened. Inside lay the crooked bean necklace she had made weeks ago. "For you." Daniel crouched slowly. The scar under his ribs tugged as it always did. He took the string carefully. "Thank you." Emily studied his face, then leaned forward and hugged him with the full force of 3 years of trust, just once. Then she ran back to her mother. The wagon stayed another hour. Papers were signed. Thanks were spoken. A leather purse Daniel never opened was placed on the porch table. Before leaving, Emily's mother walked to him. Her voice trembled. "You gave my daughter a future." Daniel only nodded. The wagon rolled away as afternoon light softened over the valley. Emily leaned over the seat until the road bent out of sight, her small hand waving. Daniel stood beside the gate until the dust settled. Then he turned back toward the half-built barn. The valley was quiet again, not the lonely quiet of winter, a living quiet, work waiting, neighbors nearby, a future no longer buried under snow. Ruth stepped onto the porch and crossed her arms. "You going to wear that necklace or frame it?" Daniel looked down at the crooked string of beans in his hand. A rough smile touched the corner of his mouth. He slipped it into his shirt pocket over his heart. Then he picked up his hammer and walked back to the barn frame. Wood waited. Sunlight warmed the valley, and the life Daniel Mercer had thought winter had taken from him had quietly begun again. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help this old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matter. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.